So, undoubtedly, this was a shorter timetable at the very least. We heard yesterday from Jonathan Powell that the government was seeking 1.9 weeks extra time for diplomatic purposes. Would you have found that helpful for military purposes as well?
Undoubtedly.
I mean, how concerned were you about the issue that has been raised about delays, meaning that troops had to hang around in uncomfortable conditions?
And I asked about that on a fairly regular basis. I was always told that although it would be uncomfortable, in a sense, that was the benefit of a relatively late deployment, because the 6-month timescale would take us, as I said earlier, into the summer. So the answer was always that they would be able to wait until the time to go. I mean, obviously, there were considerations about heat and about delay, but they were not central factors. Had there had been a 9-week delay, I'm sure it would have been helpful, but that was not a factor in terms. Sorry, their readiness or preparation was not a factor affecting whether or not we went on a certain day in March. What
sort of reassurances did you seek in March 2003 that our forces were ready in fit state to fight?
Well, there was a very detailed process, which I believe to be bottom-up, but in the sense that each unit, each organisation up the chain would have to indicate that it was ready for the kind of task that had been allocated to it. And ultimately, rather parallel in a sense to the legal certification, the Chief of the Defence Staff had to give me a certificate to say that they had achieved what is known as full operational capability, which is that they have the capability of conducting the operation as described to them. And that was achieved, I think, for all units 2 days or so before the invasion began.
When you hear the phrase full operational capability, how do you understand it in terms of tolerances, margins for error within that?
Well, I mean, inevitably I accept that there are going to be tolerances within that, but the way I understand it, and this is very clear and I think very important, is that this is a military judgment, a military decision by those who are expert in the field, that they are ready to conduct the operations that have been specified. And I played no part in making that assessment. That was entirely a matter for the military chain, as I say, not simply at the top, but as I understood the process, working from the bottom up, giving an indication at every level that those military units and organisations were ready to do the job that had been assigned to them.
As the senior political figure in the Ministry of Defence, if they were being over-optimistic, you would be the one who'd still have to explain what had happened. Were you confident that the military were not encouraging you to believe this because they couldn't? The alternative was the Americans would go without.
And could I add a postscript? Looking at the psychology of military commanders at every level, from unit upwards, battalion, battle group, and so on up the line, it's going to take a lot of moral courage to say to your superior commander, well, I'm sorry, I'm not ready, and I won't go, even though the rest of you do.
I accept that the great strength of the armed forces is a real can-do attitude, that they will go and do things. But in the end, the alternative is, and I'm sure if we were investigating something in a different way, it would not at all be appropriate for a politician to substitute his or her judgment for the military professional judgment of people who were long experienced in the field. So I accept that there is that risk, and I mean, we spent a lot of time on ensuring that we could deliver this equipment in time. If anyone had said, look, we have some doubts about whether we are ready, and then that would have been absolutely a showstopper.
Now, we heard from a number of our generals that have given evidence. But the reason that they were confident that they were ready was because they were fighting Iraqi troops in the condition that they were in after all those years since 1991 and the degradation they'd faced. So that against a different army they wouldn't necessarily have felt so ready. Is that fair? Is that your understanding?
Well, I think in a sense I have described that there was a process for determining the nature of the task for each of the units involved. They had to certify that they were fully ready for those tasks. So necessarily, I assume, in the professional judgment, they would take account of the enemy that they were likely to confront. But at the same time, these are hugely experienced, very successful professional soldiers who are making professional judgments. And back to the three-legged stool, I relied upon their professional judgment as to their military capability. And I don't think you would have. I don't think the inquiry or anyone would be happy for a lapsed lawyer to come along and say, actually, I disagree with your professional military judgment.
No, I think it's a question of understanding what the risks were that were being taken at the time. And as we've already heard, the actual operation itself justified the confidence of the armed forces. But in terms of the readiness of individuals to fight, it may have seemed like a different story. That the soldiers being put into battle may not have felt that they were personally quite so ready as the unit as a whole. Is that fair?
There were certainly some complaints about, I've mentioned already, desert combats. Quite a lot of the soldiers went into action in green combats, and they didn't like that. I understood from some of the lessons learned processes afterwards that judgments were made by senior officers that did not affect their military capability. It may have affected to some extent morale and a sense of being valued and appreciated, but it didn't actually affect their ability to fight.
But, I mean, if we just look at this question of clothing, we can look at boots as well, which was a related issue. I think the figure was that only 40% of what was needed, of the extra that had been ordered, was available in theatre by the 13th of April, so almost as the conflict.
40% of what?
Of the extra boots and clothing.
Well, I
think this comes from the NAO report.
Right. Again, but what I don't know is what boots were more important than clothing, in the sense that I recognise that hot conditions, having appropriate kind of desert boots is important. I've conceded already that the clothing wasn't always available to the extent that the soldiers would have liked. What I don't know is what proportion of that 40% were boots as opposed to clothing.
Well, I think it was quite similar, because I think stocks were available for about 9,000 prior, and this goes back to our earlier discussion, which is why it's relevant. Stocks were available for about 9,000. I think orders were put in for about 30,000 boots, and similar numbers of uniform, except you have to multiply it by 3 because they need extras. So I think the numbers are the same. Obviously, as you say, boots were always are a cause of particular irritation. But if your boots melt in the sun, it's not a small matter.
No, I think we actually looked at that particular illustration. I think there was one soldier who, I think he may actually have been in the Royal Air Force, but I can't quite recall, who took with him the wrong boots. There were not widespread problems of boots melting in the sun.
But they weren't the right boots for the conditions in which
some soldiers, I'm sure, did not have the right boots.